Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with me for today's devotion. We are in Acts chapter 9. And after reading this chapter, what I thought about and a question that I wrote at the top of my journal is, do believers ever suffer? Do people who have great faith in God ever suffer? Do bad things happen to them? Or are we always blessed? If we have enough faith, are we always blessed with life and health and wealth and success and happiness? If you listen to some TV preachers, you would think that if you are really walking with Jesus and have enough faith, you're always going to be blessed and everything be well. I wonder what these preachers do with chapters like chapter 9. Do they ignore it? Do they honestly deal with it? Because in this chapter, we have a record not only of Saul's conversion, and you'll remember Saul, once he was saved and became a missionary, started using his Roman name, Paul, instead of his Hebrew name, Saul. So we have the account of his conversion, but we also have here the description of his persecution that we talked about some yesterday in chapter 8. His persecution of Jesus' followers, and it was very real, it was very severe, and those believers in the early church suffered at the hands of Saul, and their suffering was serious. Look at verse 1 of chapter 9. It says Saul, still breathing, literally breathing in. It was like he was breathing threats and murder. Notice that word, threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, the followers of Jesus. And he went to the high priest asking for authorization in verse 2 to travel to the city of Damascus and find any followers of Jesus in that city, whether they were men or women, and bring them bound, at the end of verse 2, bring them bound in chains to Jerusalem. And you'll remember yesterday in chapter 8, going house to house, dragging men and dragging women out of their house and throwing them in prison. And Saul here wanted to do the same thing in the city of Damascus. Now, soon after that, as he's on his way to Damascus, he has this encounter with Jesus and is saved very miraculously. And when he's in the city of Damascus, blind for 3 days, and I think it's interesting that it's 3 days, the number of days Jesus was in the grave. God speaks to a believer there named Ananias and sends him to Saul, and Ananias is afraid to go. And in verse 13, Ananias answered, talking to the Lord, Ananias answered, Lord, I have heard from many about this man and how much harm he did to your saints in Jerusalem. Saul here had done great harm to the followers of Jesus. That's not a mild word. And but God makes it clear to Ananias that Saul is saved and is going to be a preacher and a missionary. And so Ananias goes, and Saul's vision is restored, and he's baptized, and he begins preaching Jesus there in Damascus. And down in verse 21, the people there in Damascus listening to Saul now preach Jesus were flabbergasted, because just the other day he was persecuting those same people. And in verse 21, all those hearing him continued to be amazed and were saying, is this not he, the man, Saul, who in Jerusalem destroyed those who called on this name, on Jesus' name? Notice the word, that Saul in Jerusalem destroyed believers, destroyed Christians. Then the Jews in Damascus plot to have him killed. He escapes and makes his way to Jerusalem where the apostles are. And in verse 26, they're afraid of him because of all he had done to hurt God's people, until Barnabas goes in and speaks. to them on behalf of Saul. Now, what's the point of all those? The persecution of the believers under the leadership of Saul in Jerusalem and other places was real. It was harsh. It was severe. It was destructive. It was painful. And these were all followers of Jesus who were faithful. Who were faithful. The idea that being faithful to Jesus means that nothing bad ever happens, the Bible doesn't support that kind of teaching, that kind of preaching. Now, Saul gets saved, and it's miraculous, and in verses 15 and 16, he's called to ministry. In verse 15, the Lord said to him, this is Saul now, go. He saw God speaking to Ananias. Ananias, you're going to go over here to Saul, and you're going to tell him what I said. So Ananias is the one who went and explained this call to ministry. God says, Ananias, you go over there. And in verse 15, go, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. He's going to be a great missionary, great apostle, great preacher. But I want you to notice verse 16. For I will show him how much he, Saul, later Paul, how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Now think about that a minute. God's very call to Saul or Paul to be an apostle, to be a missionary, to be a preacher, to be an evangelist, God's very call to ministry for Saul included suffering. I will show him how much he must suffer. The point is, if you have a biblical theology, that theology must have room in it for suffering saints. If your theology does not have a place for suffering and pain, then your theology is inadequate and unbiblical. And these TV preachers and others do great damage because they set sincere, honest believers up for disillusionment, causing some to abandon the faith even when bad things happen and they say, well, I thought God loved me and I'm his. Why? And we need to understand that followers of Jesus are not exempt from pain. What we do have is the Lord's presence and comfort and peace when we hurt. We also know that being godly keeps some pain out of our lives because a lot of the pain we experience we bring on ourselves because of our sin. We also know that in heaven, all will be made well. Saints suffer. And we're blessed. But don't let anybody, I don't care how smooth they talk, ever tell you saints never suffer. Because we do. And that's the word for today. I'll see you tomorrow as we look at chapter 10.